2 years ago, I mentioned that I would review the book Turning Pro by Stephen Pressfield. 2 years later, I've discovered the meaning of the book Turning Pro by Stephen Pressfield, and so I felt that it was now time to give my review on this book. Stephen Pressfield writes about how fear cripples us in so many ways. And in Turning Pro, he talks about how this fear is called resistance, and it keeps us from fulfilling our destiny and our life purpose. The way Stephen Pressfield shows us the path that he uses to move out of this resistance is through turning pro. And he outlines throughout the book the difference between being an amateur and being pro. And I've taken out 3 main points that have shifted my mind from one of an amateur to one of a pro. The first major mind shift is that a pro will focus and deepen their work, refining their skills constantly to a level where they're using their skill instinctively and from their authentic nature. And an amateur, by contrast, will be consumed by distractions, fear, or hope, sometimes on topics totally irrelevant to what they're working on. They may be in a state of distraction with the people around them, in a mindset of blaming or looking at the situations in life and creating excuses. They might be addicted to certain things in their life, like sex or love, thinking of their lovers, romanticizing the world, hoping for something new and different. They may be addicted to media and comparisons with what other people are doing. In all of these addictions is a level of distraction and resistance to what your true path is, and to sitting down and deepening and focusing your work. Number two is that the pro will utilize his negative points and the negatives that he finds within him to actually strengthen and refocus, but does not allow these negatives to compel him to the point of exhaustion. So he won't overwork on these negatives. He practices, or she practices, they both practice self-compassion for themselves. In Turning Pro, you can see where you are deficient in something and maybe where you have a distraction. And say your habit or distraction was of a sexual nature, where you would habitually fantasize about someone and waste loads of energy and time in a state of hope or desire for someone. How Stephen Pressfield converts that into your strength is that you have a true desire for oneness, for oblivion with the one. And that desire is manifesting itself in a distraction, which is sexual. However, if you were to deepen and focus on your work, you would find the reality of what you are actually aiming for, which is the oblivion into oneness with your work. So finding the compassion within allows you to keep on going where you would otherwise stop yourself in your track and hold to the distractions or the resistances of not feeling worthy enough or not deserving or etc., etc. So holding that compassion that perhaps one day you will not be at your desk writing or enhancing and refining your skills, and you will find a resistance, but that you will come back to the table again the next day without any compulsion to hurt yourself, to blame yourself, and to put yourself down. The amateur, by contrast, seeks instant gratification, and because he or she is so identified with the self and self-preservation, she or he finds it difficult to look at the world through the eyes of others, and which makes them often privy to feelings of jealousy, unkindness, insensitivity. And when you see someone being like that with others, be sure that they're saving the best of that cruelty for themselves. So whatever is coming out of someone is usually what they're doing to themselves inwardly. And without the compassion, without the self-compassion, to understand that within that desire of jealousy is also an admiration, or within that feeling of insensitivity is a calling to go in. Without that work of using the weakness and finding its strength, its higher vibration, then we wouldn't go on. We wouldn't go on with turning pro, because in essence, turning pro is pulling out your higher self, is reaching for your greatness through the work that you create. There is a distinction here that the work, your purpose, your higher purpose, your destiny, is not necessarily your vocation. And your vocation can be a tool for you to bring out your higher self. But your destiny is that place that starts with the joy of your heart, the compassion of your heart, where you're working is something that is drawing your soul and comes from the place of the amateur, comes from the base, because the word amateur actually means to love. And so it starts from the amateur place where you feel, I am an amateur in this. But then it translates to the place where you are turning that amateur love into a professional calling. And the third level that I found in Stephen Pressfield's book that was a mind shift for me was that the pro recognizes the dualistic nature of epiphany, that even when there's progress, there can be 2 steps taken back again to redirect, to refocus intention. For the amateur, the intention behind any work is not the self-mastery or the mastery of the work and to create the masterpiece. It's more for the purpose of proving a point or to please or some external validation or recognition that the person is using as their motivating force. And that will actually stop the amateur in their tracks from evolving and from growing. Stephen Pressfield uses a quote by Krishna in this phase of the book where Krishna says, we have the right to our labor, not to the fruits of our labor. So in other words, look not to the fruits of the labor, look to the labor. And find rapture in the labor. That's what I would add. So he also says on page 56 and 57 that the amateur takes himself so seriously that he paralyzes himself. The amateur fears, above all else, being seen and judged as himself. So he remains inauthentic, someone other than who he really is, and he is imprisoned by what he believes ought to think, ought to look like, what he thinks he ought to do, and who he ought to be. In summary, the amateur is terrified and is confined by his fears, which makes him easily distracted. The professional is terrified too, but he is liberated. The difference is the way the professional faces his fear and uses his fear as an understanding of his strength. So, as a summary, I've put together some simple steps for turning pro. One is to sit in solitude and silence for extended periods, or to meditate with the intention of knowing that you are somehow hiding or seeking to hide your higher nature. So looking for what is preventing you, what is the barrier to manifesting, experiencing your higher nature. And two, achieve self-compassion to the point of overflow, enough to look in the mirror and to love all that you see, because compassion, self-compassion, prompts you to action. And from that place, then focus and deepen. Focus and deepen to create your life's work, putting an intention into your work. Stephen Pressfield says, our intention as an artist is to get better, to get deeper, to work closer and closer to the bone. Your terror never goes away, bite it in the bum, by showing up in the same place at the same time every day. And I can tell you, when you do that, so when I've decided, when I cleared a lot of what was in my way, and I found the self-compassion of to be with myself and to love myself, I worked on what brought me joy and what compelled me, and I decided to write and to dance. And I sit down at my desk every day at the same time in the morning, and I'm on my work dance floor at the same time in the afternoon. And what I can tell you is that the process of turning pro is one of a breakthrough where you start to feel a certain sense of magic arise, where in days where it's blasé, the next day there's an epiphany, and you're blowing over, you're writing, you're dancing from a place that you've never danced before, that you're writing with a flow that comes beyond your understanding of how those words came to be. And the magic that is created is a direct access of your intention to your higher soul. And that transition from lower self to higher soul is what the work is all about, is what turning pro is all about. And I'd have to say, that from there isn't really any turning back, because there comes a new addiction to vibrating at the higher frequencies, and understanding the process of how to get there is in setting your mind to deepen, to focus, and to refine constantly. And the next day after this flow, you might come back to the table again and experience nothing so great or magical. But the idea is that there is no expectation, that unlike the amateur who is hoping for something or fearing, you're in the moment, and your intention is to deepen and to refine. Thank you.